Welcome to Charting the Course, Navigating the Future of American Naval Power. Today we're honored to welcome Dr. Scott Savitz, a renowned senior engineer at the RAND Corporation. Dr. Savitz is distinguished for his innovative approaches in leveraging new technologies and tactics to enhance the operational capabilities and resilience of military forces. With a profound commitment to advancing defense strategies, he holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Yale University and a master's degree and PhD at the same field from the University of Pennsylvania. As a prominent figure and defense analyst, Dr. Savitz has led pivotal research in the areas such as the impact of non-lethal weapons, the integration of uncrewed platforms in military strategies, and the evaluation of military capability gaps in challenging environments like the Arctic. His insightful studies have provided crucial perspectives on strategic investments in emerging technologies by global military powers and the infrastructural needs for testing autonomous systems. Dr. Savitz, in light of your research on non-lethal weapons and uncrewed platforms, how do you see specific technologies shaping the future of naval warfare and sea power? And could you also elaborate on the role of emerging technologies like AI and autonomous systems in this transformation?
Uncrewed vehicles offer a number of advantages relative to crewed ones. They are able to provide, first of all, potentially more payload, perhaps greater endurance because you don't have to support people. You can also potentially take more risk with them, send them to places where it would be too dangerous to send human beings. And you can also integrate them increasingly as part of a unified crewed, uncrewed set of assets. This applies across multiple domains for uncrewed aircraft, surface vehicles, and undersea vehicles. Regarding non-lethal weapons, these are important in several different contexts. One is if you're dealing with, say, civilian fishing vessels that you're trying to get to disperse, and in some cases, as with China's maritime militia, they may not be entirely civilian. If you want to be able to push back against their presence, intrusions, or certain behaviors, that it's advantageous to have, as we say in the non-lethal weapons business, a capability that's between shouting and shooting. So, for example, something that dazzles someone, creates a degree of glare, but without causing any permanent eye damage, can be very advantageous in that context. You can also use them in contexts where you're having a gray zone standoff with a hostile warship that is threatening to ram you, as we've seen from Chinese vessels. Also, they may be of some utility in combat contexts. Even when you are using lethal force, sometimes non-lethal capabilities that may provide unexpected stimuli can be a powerful complement to those. These are just some of the ways in which these capabilities can be valuable, and there are a whole set of technologies. You alluded to some AI, autonomy, 3D printing, I would add, and material science, and a number of others that are important.
Looking at specifically at China, Russia, maybe even Iran, how do you see these technologies, particularly uncrewed and maybe, the non-lethal? How do you see them affecting our strategy in these particular areas?
Our ultimate strategy is driven by national aims and goals, but we are able to implement some changes primarily at the operational level, one rung below strategy with respect to how we do things. So, for example, what we've seen over the last couple of decades is the emergence of uncrewed aerial vehicles in a way that was not really possible in, say, 2000, and that many missions that would have otherwise required a piloted aircraft are now taken care of by these new uncrewed capabilities. We're at a much lower state of maturity with respect to the uncrewed surface and undersea vehicles, but we're moving up. And so there's been a lot of great work by DARPA, by the Office of Naval Research, and by others looking at how can uncrewed surface vehicles be used to complement existing crewed assets? We're certainly nowhere near having fully fledged uncrewed combatants yet. That will take some years, but we do see them offering a hand, and we've seen them most active in the Fifth Fleet area of operations, namely the Middle East, to include the Persian Gulf. And we're seeing them be used increasingly, partly for testing purposes to explore the capabilities of these systems, but also they can aid us in helping to confront Iran's continual provocations, attempts to threaten U.S. or allied vessels in that region of the world.
So unmanned aircraft could extend the life of aircraft carriers. Carriers could hang back a little further and use unmanned aircraft to attack.
Yes. So one of the limitations on the endurance or range of a piloted aircraft is simply pilot fatigue. And when you remove the pilot, not only do you get some space and you no longer need to have all of the systems associated with keeping a human being alive at an extreme elevation, but you also then untether yourself from those human limitations in terms of endurance. And so you can have an uncrewed aircraft that, as long as it's able to meet up with tanker aircraft, and we have uncrewed tanker aircraft that are now being used, those can be paired so that you can go much longer ranges, or you can loiter in an area for substantially longer than you would be able to with a piloted aircraft. And that enables both the ability to project power into areas where you might not have been able to previously, while also keeping the aircraft carrier further from harm's way.
Manned planes and then unmanned, extending beyond that.
Any combination that you can think of that makes plausible sense will likely be developed in the coming decades. So whether that's a crewed aircraft launching a smaller uncrewed aircraft, or doing the same thing among surface vehicles, that will likely happen. We're going to see mixes of uncrewed and crewed aircraft being launched from the same aircraft carrier, or for some types of naval aviation from the same land bases. And we're also going to see uncrewed aircraft being launched from uncrewed surface vessels and potentially from uncrewed undersea vehicles. It's perfectly possible for a small aircraft to be launched from something that doesn't have any people on it. And the uncrewed surface vessel, USV, is capable of potentially providing a number of support functions for that uncrewed aircraft that it has launched. It may serve as a communications node. It may be a place that recovers the aircraft. Whether or not it can relaunch, that may take some technological development, as opposed to the USV having to go back and have the human being do it. But we're looking at a tremendous variety of capabilities associated with varied combinations of these.
Dr. Savitz, what role do you see for non-lethal uncrewed technologies enhancing the U.S. Navy's cooperation and interoperability with the allies, particularly in key regions like the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East and Europe?
For a number of countries, there's an inherent challenge where they would like to not be intimidated by China or Russia or Iran, or even in some cases North Korea, but they want to also make sure that they do not rapidly escalate. And this is also a key U.S. interest as well. Managing that escalation can often be done using non-lethal capabilities and the broader suite of what are termed intermediate force capabilities, or IFCs. And that includes not only non-lethal capabilities, but also some related areas like electronic warfare, cyber effects, and also information operations in ways that do not inflict direct kinetic harm to human beings or permanent damage to equipment. And so employing those in situations in the gray zone where you want to be firm and not simply allow an aggressor to behave in a certain way, but where you really don't want to start a shooting war or a major international incident or even cause one fatality. So non-lethal capabilities can be immensely useful in that context. And whether that's the ADS, the active denial system that creates a temporary heating sensation under the skin, which is fully reversible as soon as the beam moves or as the person is no longer standing within it, and there's no permanent harm done. But nonetheless, it's a forceful gesture to back off. There are also capabilities that work against vessels as long as they're not too particularly large, such as the ability to impede propellers and things like this. So using those as appropriate, having additional tools in the toolkit to be able to forcefully push back, but without inflicting damage that could lead to a major international incident or worse, can be truly valuable. And allies and partners welcome that as well. They recognize that while they strongly appreciate, in many cases, the support of the United States and our involvement in their regions, their neighbors are going to be their neighbors forever. They don't choose them. And so finding ways to manage the threat and creeping attempts to encroach on their sovereignty without overly provoking a potential rival.
In terms of personnel and organization, training, our overall doctrine, do you see major changes coming, integrating these systems into the existing organization?
There are challenges. They're surmountable, and it takes time and resources, and it takes some culture shifts. So just as we've seen with a whole host of transitions from a wooden navy powered by sails to a nuclear powered navy with aircraft carriers and submarines over the course of just a little bit more than a century, we're looking at some changes that are likely to occur within the next few decades. So pilots are already appreciating that there's going to be increased use of uncrewed aircraft, UAVs. The roles of pilots will shift. At some points, they will likely be supervising remotely, perhaps a group of aircraft, in some cases, perhaps a single one. As autonomy improves, that supervisory role will grow less and less critical. We're also likely to see similar evolutions in terms of some of the uncrewed surface vehicles that are emerging, and we're going to be seeing increasing use of off-board platforms by a number of different types of vessels. So, for example, while there will always be a need for personnel aboard submarines, we may see them employing ever more uncrewed vehicles that operate from those submarines. And uncrewed vehicles that are not in any way affiliated directly with submarines may in fact substitute for submarines in some cases. And because submarines are such a precious, low-density asset, we're going to potentially see a shift in what surface warfare officers do, the way in which they are supervising uncrewed surface vehicles, which may in fact be as large as a combat warship. And so how does that play out? There's going to need to be some cultural and training shift. And like the previous shifts that I mentioned from, say, the early 19th century to the mid-20th, we're going to see it play out over some time.
Dr. Savitz, how can the U.S. Navy effectively leverage non-lethal weapons and uncrewed platforms to maintain a strategic advantage over its rivals? And what are the potential risks and vulnerabilities associated with these technologies?
A critical part of competing with other powers takes place in the gray zone, which is itself defined in various ways, but is broadly understood as the transition between full-fledged peace and outright conflict. And in the gray zone, we've seen in recent decades, China and Russia, and to a lesser extent, Iran, and even North Korea attempting to push the envelope. And whether that's China attempting to establish domination over the South China Sea or to push against its neighbors in various ways or try to impose stress on Taiwan and its military forces, Russia doing the same for many of its neighbors. The gray zone is a critical way in which these non-lethal weapons and more broadly intermediate force capabilities play a critical role. We need to be able to push back without that kind of descent into outright combat. We want to manage the challenge. And so non-lethal capabilities that can inhibit another nation's ability to intimidate its neighbors or to occupy certain key features or to try to drive another nation's forces from a key feature that they control. For example, China's aiming to drive Philippine forces out of the Second Thomas Shoal. To the extent that we have these capabilities, we're able to push back effectively against that. Again, it reassures our allies about our desire to avoid a full-scale conflict.
Well, when you look at China on the globe and you see that they're really surrounded by offshore islands on the eastern frontier and then high mountains on the western frontier, they really are boxed in so that you could expect them to be pushing the envelope, as you say.
Absolutely. And they perceive that their prior experience as dominating East Asia for much of recorded history, or at least the parts of East Asia that they were interested in, they hope to resume that again. And having had their economy grow exponentially over the last 3 to 4 decades, they're perceiving a degree of self-importance and a willingness to take risks to expand their power in every respect. So yes, they're tremendously inhibited by what is called typically the first island chain. It's an arc that extends from Japan down to Malaysia and Indonesia. And one of the many reasons why they are interested in acquiring Taiwan is because that would break them through that first island chain and give them external capabilities to move beyond that chain more freely.
There's been some questions from various sources about ethical, moral aspects to the uncrewed in particular. We see these articles about people sitting at their computer in Arizona or whatever, killing people halfway around the world as they follow a camera on a missile closing in on a target. People get killed, and these guys at the end of their watch finish their cup of coffee and go home. Are there people exploring those aspects, wondering about what we ought to be doing or not doing in those respects?
There's widespread debate about when it's permissible to either use force remotely or to have a machine autonomously use force. And I'd like to emphasize that those things are different. What you just described is remote and a case in which one side is completely invulnerable to the other. Arguably, that kind of continual observation that is afforded by the situation that you just described enables more precise targeting, reduced risk to civilians. If you perceive that there are civilians in the area of an important terrorist, you're able to wait and then target at an appropriate time. The question of autonomous weapons gets into all sorts of issues of how much do we trust a machine to make the final decision about what to target? And to some extent, machines have been making those decisions for a very long time. Naval mines, which the U.S. First used in 1777, were autonomously detonating upon contact. In that case, they were aiming to contact British ships. In recent decades, there are questions of when a missile or other weapon is launched, to what extent are you confident that it will, in fact, hit the desired target rather than an undesired one? And so these are being debated. There needs to be a lot of confidence in the capabilities of these systems, and also a recognition that human beings can and often have gotten it wrong, dropping weapons on the wrong target and so on. And so trying to figure out when machines have a greater capability than humans of achieving target accuracy, and when it's appropriate not to have a human being make that final decision about what to target or even whether to target something. It gets into legal questions, but we've already had a great deal of it. I would also add that we recognize increasingly that loitering around the target, which is a capability which is afforded by items which, if they're not technically uncrewed vehicles, are weapons that behave a lot like them. Those capabilities can help with additional precision in terms of targeting. We've heard talk, particularly in the Ukraine war, about loitering munitions that are awaiting the moment in which they're directed to strike at something. Increasingly, we'll be seeing that with other weapon systems as well.
Dr. Savitz, what would you like the U.S. public, America, to know about these procedures and these policies?
I'd like the public to shed a lot of their preconceptions. There's a lot of negativity about the concept of killer robots, and that's been a science fiction trope for many decades, and that there are reasons to be concerned about excessive trust in automated or autonomous systems, but there are also good reasons to have elevated confidence. Again, you may have more time to make decisions, and a machine that doesn't get tired or disoriented may make better ones in some cases. I think we also need to look at the way in which non-lethal weapons are used. And these are two separate subjects, although you can have, for example, uncrewed vehicles that employ non-lethal weapons. And there may be, in fact, an opportunity to build the trust curve by empowering uncrewed vehicles to use such capabilities autonomously, with the recognition that even if they do so incorrectly, even if they cause intense glare or other discomfort to an individual, it's okay because there will be no lasting effects. And so the non-lethal weapons side of the house, I've seen articles about heat ray is potentially going to be used in ways that will be awful, or all sorts of things in articles that are mostly sensational about what these actually do. And as one person in the military said, it's absurd that it's seen as much less harmful to shoot someone than to cause them temporary discomfort. And so I think we need to recognize that there are times when non-lethal capabilities are appropriate. In some cases, that these are really valuable additions to what military forces are able to do. And also to make the finer distinctions, going back to the uncrewed side of the house, uncrewed does not mean autonomous. That often uncrewed vehicles are remotely controlled in ways that enable someone who is just not physically aboard to have essentially total control over the vehicle.
How about policymakers? What would you like those policymakers, those decision makers, and specifically those that are not really involved in the military or the committees that make up the defense, what would you like those individuals to know about this conversation?
I'd certainly like them to know all those same things, but I'd also like them to know that there's a lot of thought going into these issues. And there's misperceptions by lots of policymakers, especially since so few members of Congress have military, not only firsthand military experience, but either through their families or close friends or any experience of working with the military prior to becoming members of Congress. Those folks need to be aware of how deliberative the Pentagon is being about when it's appropriate to use different kinds or levels of force. I also think those folks need to be aware of the value of non-lethal or intermediate force capabilities, because there's a perception that the effectiveness of military forces may be measured in the amount of damage inflicted, and sometimes that's entirely appropriate. On the other hand, particularly in the gray zone where we spend most of our time, there's also a need to be able to achieve what I was was describing earlier, that pushing back, but without using lethal force. And so perceiving those opportunities and not dismissing opportunities simply because they are not going to inflict lethal harm, or because they don't come associated with a big, highly visible program that has all kinds of superlatives associated with it. Sometimes capabilities can be quite formidable and effective, even when they're using relatively simple technologies or when they're not something that's particularly noted by the public.
Thank you for that. I think it's also important to note that a lot of these are already standard protocols. So the government, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, yourself, others have written out specific rules in collaboration with international partners as well, right, Alice?
Absolutely. We work closely with allies on what's appropriate in different situations and how to manage this. We've been seeing, for example, particularly Chinese aggressive behavior over the last decade off its shores in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and even east of Taiwan. This has been well considered. There are always risks in any encounter when the United States, for example, is demonstrating freedom of navigation or working with an allied nation to help it secure its sovereign territory or its waters. But that this is given a great deal of attention, and it's being done in close concert with allies and partners.
What would you like naval officers to know about these conversations?
Some of the same points as for the prior two groups. Certainly there's a need to not be dismissive of non-lethal capabilities. In a military that focuses primarily on lethal capabilities, these are nonetheless important. Also, to understand the capabilities and current limitations of uncrewed vehicles, figuring out how to use them. And we're still at a stage where the technology is maturing, particularly for the surface and undersea side of the house. Just as people, for example, in the 1920s and 30s were saying, how do aircraft carriers and battleships coordinate as we transition from a primarily battleship navy to aircraft carriers? Or how should aircraft from different ships be coordinating with one another? And intense debate during that same period about whether, in fact, battleships or aircraft carriers were going to predominate in the coming decades. So thinking through the problems and testing, and some of this is experimentation, exercises, and just operational experience. If I put this uncrewed undersea vehicle into the water, what are the problems in terms of launch and recovery, or mutual interference between that and some other operation being performed on the ship? Or what trade-offs can or should I make in order to accommodate something that's being hosted on the ship that wasn't there before? What am I taking off? Or when do I home port something in an actual port, and when do I host it on a ship or possibly an aircraft? These are all questions that are going to require testing and exploration. Also learning from China's responses to various non-lethal capabilities, looking at that other side of the house.
Bill and I are working to build a stronger Navy, and we're interested in your ideas about what we can best do to help that.
There are several different time spans that we can look at. In the near term, there needs to be experimentation with some of these systems and operators getting used to them, investing in them. The Navy has been much more eager to embrace uncrewed vehicles in some areas than others. That a decade ago, when I first was the lead author on a report looking at uncrewed surface vessels, that it seemed like the Navy was underdeveloped in terms of its capabilities there, in part because there were no advocates. So thinking about ways in which to shift organizationally to reflect the fact that uncrewed platforms will increasingly play a key role. Some of that groundwork needs to be laid within the next 5 to 10 years, and just educating, especially junior officers and enlisted personnel, about how the Navy is evolving, not just how it is or how it's been. A second piece, looking towards more the midterm, 10 to 20 years, starting to devote more resources to these maturing technologies and to ancillary technologies that can provide benefits alongside them. So, for example, if you need to take things off of your ship because you're now going to be hosting a bunch of smaller uncrewed vehicles, then maybe some of the space reduction can be accommodated simply by improvements in 3D printing. That if you are able to store a dense closet full of powder instead of every conceivable spare part that you need for every purpose, then you're able to reduce volumes significantly. If you're able to automate certain things, if you're able to have one pilot supervise several or more UAVs, because the UAVs are more capably autonomous and are coordinating with one another. These are opportunities for the U.S. Navy to advance. I also see in the long term, uncrewed vessels will increasingly be central to the Navy. And that's everything from what has sometimes been termed arsenal ships. If we have a ship that is designed exclusively not for people, except when it's going into some kind of a maintenance depot, and it is simply filled to the brim with missiles or perhaps torpedoes or other weapons, and then it is close to some other ships within a carrier strike group that direct it when and where to launch its weapons, or that depend on it because maybe a USV is in fact the offboard sonar establishment or radar establishment for this carrier strike group. Thinking creatively and taking advantage of these capabilities, which are advancing so rapidly, by the mid-century, the Navy can be substantially composed of large numbers of uncrewed vessels as well as some crewed ones. And keeping in mind, of course, that since naval vessels can last for 30 to 50 years, the things we're already building today will be around in the 2070s in some cases. So managing the transition of a mixed crewed, uncrewed Navy through the whole middle of the century.
Dr. Savitz, I want to thank you for all that you do for Americans, for the scientific community, the military, our understanding of these complex issues for the Navy. And we certainly also thank you for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a tremendous honor to appear here, and I greatly appreciate the privilege of speaking with you.